Okay, let's start talking about cell theory. Cell theory has three parts to it. The first is that all living things are made of cells. In the simplest terms, a cell is nothing more than just a membrane-bound sac that contains water. The second component of cell theory is that cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. So in other words, you can break living things down into individual cells, and each one of those cells can be considered alive. But if you break that cell apart into its components, you no longer have anything that is living. And the third component to cell theory is that new cells are produced from existing cells. So in other words, life has to come from something else that is already living. Alright, so now that we're studying cells, it's important to realize that all cells, or all life, fits into two separate categories of cells. We refer to these types of cells as prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells, where pro refers to before the nucleus, and eukaryotic means true nucleus. So the easiest way to remember this is that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. So let's take a look at how these two different types of cells compare to each other. Let's start by taking a look at the things that prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have in common. You can see that both of these cells have cell membranes. They contain DNA in some form or shape. They have cytoplasm, that's the liquid inside the cell that contains everything else. And both types of cells do have ribosomes. Prokaryotic cells typically are smaller cells, and they're less complex. That means that they have less organization, less stuff inside their cell. They do contain cell walls, which is not necessarily typical of all of the eukaryotic cells, but the big thing is that prokaryotic cells do not contain a nucleus, or often referred to as a membrane-bound nucleus. And most commonly, you'll see that prokaryotic cells are bacteria, or some form of bacteria. And the eukaryotic cells are going to be larger cells, more complex, they have more stuff inside them. The plants will have cell walls, but most importantly then, the eukaryotic cells contain a membrane-bound organelle that we call the nucleus. Now, if we take a look at both cells, I think you can immediately see that the cell on the right, which is a eukaryotic cell, is much more complex than the cell on the left, which is your prokaryotic cell. And if I were to actually try and shrink the bacterial cell down on the left and make it about the accurate size, but comparatively speaking, this is what you would see, where this bacteria is maybe, 1/100th to 1/10th the size of the eukaryotic cell. Alright, from here, let's go ahead and we'll take a look at each one of the organelles that you find in the eukaryotic cell individually.